I, Wilfred Butler, being of sound mind and body, at least what the world considers sound, do hereby leave my house and its grounds and all personal effects within that house to my only surviving relation, my grandson, Jeffrey Butler.
A man burns to death in his home, while alone in the sleepy town of East Willard, Massachusetts, and leaves his house abandoned for nearly 20 years, to sit as a ghost, ever present on the skyline at the horizon of the town. When, in the winter of 1970, the inheritor of the estate returns to sell the property, history seems to repeat itself, and people begin to be found dead in mysterious ways, as this tale of generational trauma that wraps both family and local politics into a web of deceit and pain, rooted in decades past, takes hold. Silent Night, Bloody Night is a really weird movie, and it might not even be a good movie, but it's certainly interesting. It was the first film that was made that used Christmas time as a setting for a horror feature, and for that alone, it should be seen as a piece of history in the timeline of horror. Although several horror films were released before this one that took place around Christmas, such as Whoever Slew Auntie Roo and Home for the Holidays, Silent Night, Bloody Night was actually filmed and completed before these films were made, and just sat on a shelf for several years before being released under the title Night of the Full Dark Moon, which was just one of many titles that this film had. It was created under the name Zora, which is a title that has nothing to do at all with the final film, before being released as Night of the Full Dark Moon in 1972. Then again as Silent Night, Bloody Night in 1973, and finally Death House in 1981, with Silent Night, Bloody Night being the title that stuck through history. While the movie might not be the best, had it not been made, a lot of films that are considered classics in the genre today would have been very different. Silent Night, Bloody Night is a really experimental film made in a really experimental time for film. Almost everything in the movie is trying something different and new, and some of it falls flat, while other bits work quite well, leaving the film to feel quite strange and surreal. But in doing this, it leaves behind a blueprint of new techniques that would later be used by other filmmakers and storytellers down the road in more successful ways, and should really be seen as a prototype to other movies that would come later like Black Christmas. An example of this is the phone calls that the killer in the film has with his victims throughout the movie before he eventually kills them. An idea which today is a massive cliche to be avoided, but at the time was a unique and new concept. It would later go on to be used in a lot of movies, like Black Christmas, New Year's Evil, When a Stranger Calls, Scream, and The Ring as just a few examples of the trope that was developed here. Other techniques are at play as well though, and would later be used in horror in iconic ways, like the first-person perspective of the killer in the house that would be used to great effect again in Black Christmas, as well as Halloween. And even some of the shots of the killer running in first person remind me a lot of the way that the evil is presented in the Evil Dead movies a decade later. The movie isn't very good by today's standards, but I might recommend checking it out if you like underground trash cinema of the time like the early works of John Waters. It's a really hypnotic film, and oftentimes what's happening on screen isn't explained or makes little sense, but that in itself makes sense when you consider the people who are working on the film. It was written by two men, Jeffrey Konvitz and Ira Teller, who had never written anything for the screen before in their lives, and directed by a man who had next to no prior experience. This was then mixed with the strange cast made up largely of Andy Warhol superstars, and the film quickly turned from a run-of-the-mill generic horror to a work of surrealist art. The surreal quality of the film is demonstrated best by the nearly 20-minute flashback that occurs near the end of the film. Shot like a silent-era movie, the flashback depicts an escape at a mental institution, where the patients attack a group of hospital staff that are holding a party on the evening of Christmas Eve. The likes of Tally Brown, On Bean, Susan Rothenberg, and George Trachis can be spotted in this scene. And these prominent figures of the fine art world greatly affected the avant-garde feel that this whole diversion in the film has. The blacked out eyes, slow movement, the dim lighting has an extremely unsettling and pervasive feel to it. In fact, most of the film has a very similar, sinister feeling, shot almost like a documentary in unrehearsed handheld style, with uncomfortable levels of realistic violence and strange, deep voice narration. But this section is the most extreme, and if the whole movie had been like this, then the film would be remembered in an entirely different way, similar to the legacy that 1990's Begotten has held on to. One thing of note from this section of the film is that this marks the last film appearance of Candy Darling before she died 2 years later of lymphoma at the age of 29. Here she laughs, eats cherries, and sips on wine, all before one of the inmates takes her wine glass and pushes it against her face until it breaks, shooting the stem directly into her eye. And for some reason, I just think that with her love of drama, she probably really enjoyed being asked to do that. The film's production was a mess. Cult star Mary Woronov hated the confusing script, and said that most people working on the film had no idea what the film was supposed to be about, and I can believe that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Not to me. Because a literal ragtag group of people got together in New York in the late 60s and made art. They did something different that was genuine work of artistic expression and started a wave of holiday-themed horror that would be picked up by others later and made into more mainstream films. And I think that says something. Because I genuinely don't know if we would have modern films like Krampus without this. If Silent Night, Bloody Night had not been made, then Black Christmas probably wouldn't have either. Or at least, it would have ended up very different, because Bob Clark borrowed a lot from this film, and it should honestly be seen as one of the key works leading up to the slasher craze of the 1980s. If Black Christmas had not been made, then Silent Night, Deadly Night might not have been made either, and the snowball of Christmas-themed horror movies might not have started at all had it not begun here. And in some small way, I think that's really important, because growing up as a kid, I always loved watching movies like Jack Frost, Gremlins, and other funny horror holiday films, and I think that is enough to be really appreciative for what this film ended up doing. And I think that's a really uplifting message to have, especially at this time of year, that if you set out to do something, even if your works aren't the best, or if in some measure you fail, if you put enough of yourself and your passion into what you do, then that alone can be seen. If you reach out and grab people, then your art touches their art, and that's how trends are made. And it's really hard to say if this film was a trendsetter or not, because we don't know what the landscape of horror would look like without it. But I certainly think that even though it is not well known, its impact was great. And it's interesting to take a massive piece of media like Halloween and trace its influences back to movies like Black Christmas, and trace those influences back to small movies like Silent Night, Bloody Night. And oftentimes, when you do this, you can find similar stories of a small group of people making a weird, small movie that would later go on to do and influence great things. And to me, that's a really positive and uplifting thing to see. And it just makes me happy that we have so many great holiday horror because of it. Merry Christmas, everyone.